Deception. It's a phrase used in pitching analysis constantly. The actual definition is to give a mistaken impression. I see it used in the media space more as a way to bucket things we can't really articulate about a pitcher that makes him good. It's a complex topic and one we're kind of limited in the discussion of in the public space because we don't have a lot of information about what happens in the body prior to ball release. Teams, on the other hand, have boatloads of this information. So I created what I call a deception tree. It's a way of breaking down what I think goes into deception in an effort to move things from the general to the specific. Even if we don't solve this puzzle of deception, spoiler, we're not going to, the goal, as always, is to learn something or get you thinking in a direction you previously hadn't. I'll boil deception down into things related to either the body or the baseball. Let's start with the body. One of the most basic ways to think about deception is hiding the baseball from the hitter's point of view. Kyle Wasserberger of Driveline Baseball pointed out how their organization can actually measure this window of visibility, or what they call occlusion score. The average pitcher has the ball visible to a hitter for about 55 milliseconds in his motion. The key point is that we can project how moving on the rubber increases or decreases the amount of time that the ball is hidden, which is shown by this graph. Move this pitcher over on the rubber, so go this way on the chart, and watch how this line increases. You're increasing the amount of time you're hiding the ball to right-handed hitters. The assumption there is that hiding the ball for longer is better, at least in a vacuum, but the reality is, I don't believe, and I don't think Driveline believes, that more occlusion, so hiding the ball for longer, unequivocally means better performance. It's a good thought that physically hiding the ball for longer helps, but I think when you zoom out and look at aggregated data, there's not a ton of signal there. Maybe it's just that being an outlier is good. Zach Greinke, for example, checks out as having one of the highest occlusion scores that Driveline has ever tracked. He hides the ball about 24% longer than the average right-handed pitcher does to right-handed hitters. But I'll admit, I don't think I've ever thought of Greinke as being deceptive. I've thought of him more as a command guy. He had velocity early in his career, but then he backed off it. He mixed multiple pitches. How much of that success was because of occlusion? It's a great question and one I don't really think we have an answer to. The problem is that we're not entirely sure what the optimal strategy is for where a hitter should look when a pitcher throws. Hitters have gaze patterns. It's generally believed that hitters do something called a saccade, which is a shift in focus from one point to another. Watch this delivery as if you're a hitter and think about where your eyes fixate throughout the motion. Among the game's best, the eyes shift from looking at the torso and head of a pitcher, or this general vicinity, to a pitcher's release point at some point in the delivery. When that happens for a given hitter is unknown. We also don't really know whether it's a soft focus thing or a hard focus thing, or which one of those two is better around that release point. We also don't really know what exact part of the arm they're looking at release, or whether it's better to look at the shoulder pre that saccade or the head, etc. You can see how this makes quantifying any kind of deception pretty tough. That gaze tracking information that hitters kind of look at something that isn't the ball throughout a delivery has always gotten me to think that perhaps it's not really about hiding the ball itself, but putting your body in a weird position such that you give that mistaken impression to a hitter. That's where I come to stride direction. We have three main release point metrics in public analysis: extension down the mound, release height, and release side. But we don't have anything that shows us the direction which somebody strides. I don't know why it took me this long to realize it, but I think this plays a pretty big role in why Chris Sale has been so good for so long. He has average stuff, average execution per FanGraphs Stuff Plus and Location Plus, and he's had that for most of his career, and yet he's going to win the Cy Young this year, and he's going to be in the Hall of Fame. He's a career 3 ERA pitcher who, from my understanding, doesn't really shake off his catcher or do a ton of game prep, which still boggles my mind. He basically goes out on the mound and throws. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a pitcher who is a better example of body deception or deception generally. This angle is a good example of his stride direction. Sale stands more towards the third base side of the rubber versus right-handed hitters, and his plant foot makes contact over here. He closes off his torso from that right-handed hitter perspective. The extreme version of this is Ryan Walker of the Giants, who has probably one of the most closed-off deliveries in the majors. Compare Sale and Walker to a more linear pitcher like Yoshinobu Yamamoto, where his stride direction lines up relatively even with where he starts on the rubber. Coaching this kind of deception into a player, however, is probably impossible. From my understanding, this closed off of a delivery can only be achieved by pitchers with pretty insane hip mobility, particularly in terms of external rotation of the hips. Otherwise, you're just going to break down pretty quickly. Maybe the more coachable version of deception is just purely release point or release point adjustments. I've always thought that really tall pitchers have a visual advantage against hitters when they get down to otherwise average release heights. Paul Skeens is a pretty good example of this. He stands 6'6", and he has a relatively average release height at 5'8". He obviously doesn't look average from his release height standpoint when you see him in person, but if you're just looking at his release traits, you're likely not calling him out as a physical outlier. Body deception exists, it just seems a bit more scoutable than coachable. Unless, that is, we start thinking of deception beyond the body and instead related to the baseball. Let's start with pitch interaction. Merrick Ramilo and Jack Lambert of Driveline Baseball gave a presentation at Sabre Seminar recently in Chicago that talked about something they call Match Plus. This is looking at trajectories of pitches in 3D space and determining what confidence the hitter has that two pitches are different from one another before that decision point of a hitter's swing. It's essentially trying to determine whether pitches match in flight and for how long. The longer they match and the more they break off, presumably the better. I'm sure there are a ton of examples to apply this topic, but one I noticed recently relates to the Red Sox and Brian Bayo. At the beginning of the season, Bayo's sinker location to righties was mostly on the inner third of the plate, and his slider was mostly away. In August, he's still throwing some sinkers inside, but he's putting them more down away or just generally down in the zone to righties. You can see the difference here on his location heat maps. As I was looking for a difference in his sinker results, of which I didn't really find anything, what I noticed is that this actually made his slider better, not from a swing and miss standpoint, but from a ground ball standpoint. His slider allowed a sub 40% ground ball rate early in the season, and since throwing that sinker more down and away, it jumped all the way up to 80%, and the only thing that really changed was this different sinker location. This is a good example of how two pitches can interact differently when thrown in different parts of the zone, perhaps giving a hitter an impression that something is going to happen, and then it doesn't. And there's one last element of deception I want to talk about, and I put it on the tree under the ball branch, even though it kind of connects back to our body branch. It's known as break-off arm angle. With arm angle, we're literally talking about the angle of your arm. This is something every baseball fan can kind of pick up on pretty quickly just by looking at a pitcher. And anybody who even knows a bit about pitch shapes will tell you that arm angle has a massive influence on fastball shape. If you're over the top, you're getting behind the ball well, creating good backspin, good vertical movement. If you're more sidearm, you're likely to lean on more sinkers, create drop, embrace your natural slot, let that natural arm position kill vertical break on a pitch. Max Bay, who used to work in research and development for the Houston Astros, he's one of my favorite follows on Twitter right now, had some visuals online that show how a pitcher's fastball shape can be somewhat unexpected. The glowing orb here is what we'd expect the pitcher's fastball shape to be based on this arm angle. Any offset from the center of this orb shows that something is unnatural and to some extent, perhaps unexpected. Spencer Schwellenbach from the Braves has stormed onto the scene with a ton of pitches, and we can see that relative to his arm angle, his fastball is cutting a bit more than one might expect. Maybe that helps him. Compare that to Shane Baz, and you can see that his fastball is one that is carrying a lot more than you'd expect based on his arm angle. The body is creating an impression that the ball flight is telling the hitter was a mistake. I think that's how I most often think about deception generally. And although I made this tree with two really nice branches between body and ball, as you see in this last example, I do think a lot of this is very intertwined. One of the complexities of baseball analysis is, although a lot of it is very binary, it's a strike or a ball, he's safe or he's out, it's a hit or it's not a hit, etc. What we run into is a lot of overlap in even trying to isolate off specific contributors to overall reasons for success. It almost makes the sport somewhat like football or other sports where there's a lot of interaction between players on the field that complicate where to place blame. That, I think, encapsulates deception really well. This video is kind of a project of mine that came together pretty quick, and I admit I didn't really talk to other people in the industry about it. I generally do a lot of pre-sourcing on stuff. I talk about, what do you think deception is? I ask coaches, I ask other individuals in the industry that I respect. And then I come to some conclusion and deliver a video. For this one, I wanted to introspect and look at what I thought deception was from this tree perspective, and then kind of go from there and thinking about it and see what everyone's reaction is to it in the public space, and hopefully learn something from it. So while I hope you learned something in this video, I also want some participation here. Let me know if you disagree or agree with any of the branches I created or any of the thoughts I had on deception. I'll be in the comments. As always, thank you for watching.